Hi, it's Dwyer. It is November 24th, 2025. Keeping it free.blogspot.com, a free site. Also, money1776.com, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Folks, I was just watching a show on ABC, and the show was called Who Killed JFK? And I, of course, have made a bunch of videos here online. And they had a gentleman on the show who claimed that he had been studying the JFK assassination for several years. And that, it wasn't the different groups people thought killed Kennedy. He was of the mindset that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in line with the Warren Commission's findings. Right now, folks, I just want to make a few points. This is not going to be the longest video. You can't just analyze the assassination by looking at the few moments before Kennedy gets hit with shots. You have to keep your own personal film rolling, and you need to ask follow-up questions. We know now, unequivocally, that the Warren Commission got it wrong, because the Secret Service agent who was with Clint Hill, the one who found the magic bullet, now openly admits that he found the magic bullet in the back seat of the limousine. He openly admits that he went to Parkland Hospital, right? That's where the car continued on. He went to Parkland Hospital, and he planted the magic bullet. In other words, the bullet that hit and shattered John Connally's wrist, right? Just understand that that bullet is different from the bullet we're calling the magic bullet. We know Arlen Specter's theory is wrong based on the Secret Service agent who found the bullet. Now let's just do the math. You have a lot of people, as you can imagine, who were young in 1963, right? Let's say 25 to 35, who now realize that they're looking at their own mortality. They're not going to be with us much longer. So they're now telling the truth, right? So folks, the magic bullet, that's a fiction. Connally himself did not believe in the magic bullet theory. He said so. Right? He's even on the show, The Men Who Shot Kennedy. He said so. Right? Folks, what you think you know, you might not know. Let's talk about a few other things. On the show, they hint that several people had an incentive to kill the President of the United States. Right? For one, he's in the state of Texas, where many people opposed school integration. And the president from Massachusetts, everyone knew, was in favor of school integration. Folks, this is 1963. Brown versus the Board of Education faced resistance, particularly in the Deep South. Right? Kennedy running in 1960 with Lyndon Johnson, Senate Majority Leader, Senator from the state of Texas, barely won the state. Some even question the authenticity of the vote count in the state of Texas. In fact, if you want to see an election where the vote count in the state of Texas was highly suspect, all you have to do is look at Lyndon Johnson's own elections. You'll find one that's so scandalous that the voters actually voted in alphabetical order at times, if you believe the vote count. Right? So just understand, Kennedy, I know by today's standards, he's not that much of a radical. By the standards of 1963, he's a full-blown revolutionary. Right? This is the youngest elected president. This is the guy who is, as insiders know, his own Secret Service knows this. This is a guy who's openly having affairs on his wife. Right? His relationship with Jackie, which was marketed to the media, was a bit different in private. Right? Both of them were smokers. Right? Kennedy is having affairs with women much younger than him. Some of the affairs are facilitated by the Secret Service. Right? Look up The Dark Side of Camelot. Excellent show with Peter Jennings talking about Cy Hersh's book. They interview some of Kennedy's Secret Service detail. And they admit that Kennedy was a philanderer. That they, at times, had to travel with Kennedy to his liaisons. It's part of the historical record that Kennedy had an affair with one of Jackie's secretaries at one point. Right? Insiders understood that Kennedy, who was a big thinker, right? Huge thinker. But Kennedy, who's ahead of his time, right? Who, asked Dr. King not to go forward with the March on Washington. The civil rights leader and his group turned down the president's request, and then Kennedy backed Dr. King. Right? He supported the March on Washington. Right? Kennedy's ahead of his time. From the Oval Office, Kennedy authors the Civil Rights Act of 1963, the one that didn't pass Congress. Right? So Kennedy's ahead of his time, but understand, Kennedy's someone who we know at one point had a liaison with an East German spy. Right? Female. Kennedy's someone who we know was involved with Judith Exner. We know that from Judith herself. At the same time, she was involved with Sam Giancana, right, who was right below Tony Accardo in Chicago's outfit. Right? Kennedy, of course, had Frank Sinatra, who had known mob ties, as part of his inaugural ball. Right? Famous moment. He was supposed to stay with Frank Sinatra. Instead, he ended up staying with Bing Cosby, because, word of him hanging out with Frank Sinatra became a little bit too hot. People understood he was hanging out with folks who had ties to organized crime. Right, so what I want people to realize is that after Kennedy is shot, there is clearly a cover-up. The mob can do a lot of things. Some of Kennedy's enemies, Russia, could do a lot of things. But what they can't do is fake the autopsy. Right? Let me tell you how botched the cover-up was. And it's a cover-up. I don't even consider this to be a conspiracy theory. Just look at the Zapruder film, right? The fact that there was a Zapruder film, I'm sure shocked a lot of people. Right? Just look at the Zapruder film, you'll see Kennedy's brain is outside his head at times, right? A lot of his brain is obviously coming out of his head. Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent who hops on the back of the limo, claims that he looks at Kennedy, and keep in mind, Clint Hill, military experience, just like Kennedy had military experience. He looks at Kennedy after Kennedy's shot. He sees the vacant look in Kennedy's eyes, and he knew in the car in that moment that Kennedy was gone. Right? This story about, people trying to save Kennedy's life at Parkland, I'll leave it up to you to figure out how true that is. Just looking at the head shot and the brain coming out of his head, and the fact that now we know people saw parts of his brain all over the place. You understand that the mass of his brain had to be far less than 100%. You know that. Just looking at the Zapruder film, no one else has to tell you. You know he lost a lot of brain matter when he got shot. But folks, that's not what the autopsy says. Right? Understand, he has a brain that's supposed to be around 100% mass. He actually has a big brain in the autopsy. So how did they cover it up? How come you're not hearing about whether or not the DNA on the brain they examined in the autopsy matched JFK's DNA? It's because our government lost JFK's brain. Right, folks? The brain is in government custody. Our government lost Kennedy's brain. Let me just say, too, you understand in Dealey Plaza, they actually found a bone fragment. Now, we're in an era where you can look up everything I say here online. Right? I've just made a statement that sounds preposterous on its face. That after one of the biggest assassinations in American history, after the brain is part of the autopsy, the alleged brain, right? Our government lost the brain. Folks, believe it or not, a bone fragment that looked like it came from the back of someone's head was found in Dealey Plaza days after the president had been assassinated. It's called the Harper fragment. Look it up. The Harper fragment. Believe it or not, our government got possession of the Harper fragment. You know what happened to the Harper fragment? You know why we can't say conclusively that the Harper fragment came from Kennedy's head? It's because, like Kennedy's brain, the Harper fragment was lost while in government custody. Right, folks? You understand, this doesn't make sense. Let's talk about another fact that makes no sense whatsoever. The Oswalds, Marina and Lee Harvey Oswald, got an invitation to stay with Ruth Paine. Now, Ruth Paine was having problems with her husband, a guy named Michael Paine. Right? She and Michael were separated. Just understand, Michael Paine, who went to a John Birch Society meeting with Lee Harvey Oswald, the two guys would hang out on their own. Think about that. If Lee Harvey Oswald is a communist, the last place he would want to be would be a John Birch Society meeting. But yet the two guys attended it. Right? Think about it. Well, just understand, Michael Paine came from money. His family helped create the Bell helicopter. Michael Payne's mother just happened to be Ruth Forbes Payne Young. Again, Ruth Forbes Payne Young. Look up this name. One of her best friends in life was Mary Bancroft. Right? Mary Bancroft. Look up all of these names. Mary Bancroft just happened to be having an affair with CIA Director Allen Dulles. Right, folks? We're supposed to believe that Oswald is just a worker at the Texas School Book Depository. No, Lee Harvey Oswald is a tenant for the son of Allen Dulles' mistress's best friend. Folks, let's be smart here. What are the odds of that? Right? I would argue they are slim. Right? They are incredibly slim. Let me say, too, that the logistics don't match up. Right? I'm to believe that Oswald gets a lift to go to work. He has a rifle in a bag that the driver of the car, Buell Fraser, claims was too short to hold a rifle. Now, what we know Oswald doesn't have on him, and keep in mind, he's supposed to have used this rifle on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Right? Recognize that no photos exist. None of the paper wrapping in which this rifle was allegedly transported to work. Right? Oswald has something in a bag. Could be his lunch. He claimed it was curtain rods, if you believe the driver. Right? But the bag's too short. You would imagine that the bag is crucial to the story here. One would imagine that after the crime, there would be a lot of photos of the sniper's nest. And there would be photos of the bag, the paper in which the rifle was carried to work. Now let's ask a background question first. If Oswald is planning on killing the president and has the wherewithal to bring a rifle to work, why didn't he also bring his gun to work? Folks, understand, Oswald doesn't have his gun. We're to believe that Oswald brings the rifle to kill the president and then isn't thinking in terms of how he's going to get away from the murder scene. Right? Now, I'm not denying that there's someone in the window on the 6th floor. Right? I'm not denying that at all. The question is, who is it? Because when Oswald is seen 90 seconds later by Marion Baker, a police officer, and his boss, Roy Truly, who would recognize him, he's on the 2nd floor. Right? You understand that. Not only that, Truly and Baker see him. Truly says, hey, that's, my employee. They shot the president. They run off. Other people then see Oswald on the 2nd floor. And what does Oswald do? He buys a Coke. Folks, he's not in a rush to leave the building. Right? Of course, the autopsy doesn't conform, not even in the slightest, to what the doctors at Parkland Hospital saw. Right? Dr. Robert McClellan sees a baseball-sized hole in the back of the president's head. That's not the way the autopsy looks. In other words, the autopsy is done by someone from the military with very little autopsy experience. Right? Was this autopsy person performing a credible autopsy, or were they following orders? Well, just understand, the JFK in the autopsy doesn't look like the JFK who the doctors see at Parkland. Right? Understand, too, the FBI agents who showed up for the autopsy thought that something was wrong. Look it up. Right? There's even a school of thought. In fact, before I go there, some people at the autopsy from, the casket place, the funeral home, they saw the amount of metal being taken out of Kennedy's head. Right? Kennedy, it looks like Kennedy got worked upon before people were allowed to watch the autopsy. Now, my point to you is the cover-up is apparent in the moments after Kennedy is shot. The mob couldn't have pulled that off. The Russians couldn't have pulled that off. Some local Texans afraid of integrated schools, they couldn't have pulled that off. The only people who could pull it off would be our United States government. Right? The only people who could lose the brain and the Harper fragment would be our United States government. Also, Kennedy fired Allen Dulles. Right? There was a big fallout over the Bay of Pigs. Right? Kennedy refused to give military cover. How is it possible that Lyndon Baines Johnson would have a guy fired by Kennedy on the Warren Commission? Folks, it makes no sense. Right? Just understand, it makes no sense. Let me say, too, that you study this closely, you're going to find out that the records suggest that there are two Oswald wallets. Right? A wallet is found where J.D. Tippit is found. But yet somehow Oswald's supposed to have his wallet on him at the Texas Theater. Also, Oswald doesn't bring a gun, the handgun, with him, right, to do the murder. He has a rifle. He doesn't have the handgun with him. You want to know his grand plan to get away from arguably the biggest murder in the United States in the 20th century? Folks, he took public transportation. Think about it. He takes a public bus. Now, you have a situation, and people need to know this. There are cameras all over the place. There's a camera that swings by the entrance of the Texas School Book Depository shortly after the presidential motorcade goes by the building. Right now, we recognize most of the people. Right? They're co-workers of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, there is one person there. Researchers have called that person Prayer Man. There is one person there who just happens to be around the same height and weight as Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, what's important is one of the people there Buell Fraser is the person who drove Lee Harvey Oswald to work that day. Right? Buell Fraser doesn't recall seeing Lee Harvey Oswald there. Right? None of the people in the doorway recall seeing Lee Harvey Oswald there. Here's the problem. None of them recall seeing the person who researchers are now calling as Prayer Man. Right? It's two different cameras that catch this person in the hallway. Right? In the doorway of the Texas School Book Depository as the motorcade passes. And while no one claims they saw Lee Harvey Oswald in the doorway, no one recalls seeing Prayer Man, who's caught on film, in the doorway. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald claimed that he was by the doorway and that he walked from the doorway to the second floor, where he's seen by Officer Marion Baker and his boss, Roy Truly. I would argue that that's much more believable than Oswald firing the shots, ditching the rifle, hitting the stairs, where other co-workers claim they were on. Women on the fourth floor claim they hit the stairway as soon as they heard the shots. Nobody sees Lee Harvey Oswald on the stairway. Think about that. We have photographic proof that there's someone in the entryway of the Texas School Book Depository standing with Oswald's co-workers, who's the approximate size of Lee Harvey Oswald. The person's off at the side, caught on two different cameras. So someone's there. We've been able to figure out where everyone else in the building was at the moment that the motorcade drives by and that photo is taken. If you believe that Prayer Man is Lee Harvey Oswald, he couldn't have gone from the ground floor up to the sixth floor in time to fire the shots. Right, let me say a couple other things too. The wrapping paper in which we believe the rifle was placed, there are photos of it outside the building, believe it or not in the sniper's nest, but outside the building. We now know that that paper came from inside the building, right? It was used to wrap books. This is the School Book Depository. Right, folks? It doesn't make sense that Oswald could have taken the paper from the building because the paper was in a room that was segmented from the other workers. There's a worker in that room who claims that he was able to keep track of all of the paper. It doesn't make sense that Oswald, who didn't have a driver's license, right? He's 24 years old. He doesn't have a driver's license. He's a new dad again, right? He has a second child recently born. It doesn't make sense that Oswald would actually have access to the paper that was used to wrap the rifle that couldn't have fit under his arm the morning of the assassination when he gets a lift to work from Buell Fraser. Right, so folks, one final thought. People run up to the grassy knoll after the assassination. They encounter Secret Service. Right? One guy actually takes out something from his wallet and waves it at them. Folks, there are no Secret Service members on the grassy knoll right after the assassination. Who's impersonating them? Understand, one of the people who heard the guy say Secret Service was a cop. Right? Credible witness. Who's impersonating Secret Service members on the grassy knoll right after the assassination? Right? Let me also add, too, what Dr. McClellan saw at Parkland, the hole in the back of of Kennedy's head, could only have come from a shot from the front. Right? You understand that the throat wound, there are people who claim that the doctor who did the tracheotomy right on top of the bullet hole in Kennedy's throat said that it looked like an entry wound. Then he got pressured. Right? If it's an entry wound, there is no magic bullet that could have hit Connolly. None. If there's a baseball-sized hole in the back of Kennedy's head, as Dr. McClellan said, he even drew a picture of it, the shot came from the front, not the back. Right? So, also the number of bullets doesn't make sense. James Tague gets hit with a bullet fragment. Where does it come from? How does it fit into the story? Let me also say that the Zapruder film itself looks altered. How could that happen if our government, the same one who lost a brain and who lost a Harper fragment, if our government was serious about locating the killer? Right? The question all of us should be asking is, what exactly did Kennedy do that would lead to the assassination and the cover-up? That's the question we should be asking, because I'm convinced the only group that could have done the assassination was our own government. Right? Now, there's a moment on the Nixon tapes. Years later, Richard Nixon is president of the United States. Understand, Nixon wins re-election in 1972 by a landslide. It's one of the biggest landslides in American history. Then the wheels come off, right? Watergate explodes. Nixon is struggling to stay in office. So he actually has either a CIA or an FBI representative in his office. And he says to the guy, this is part of American history, it's on tape. He says to the guy that he knows about the Bay of Pigs thing. Right? The Bay of Pigs thing. Kennedy, of course, had a falling out with the CIA over the Bay of Pigs, ultimately fires CIA Director Allen Dulles, the guy who's having an affair with his landlord's mother's best friend. Right? Just understand, Richard Nixon, part of the Nixon tapes, is on tape telling a member of the intelligence community, threatening that member, that he knew about the Bay of Pigs thing. Right? It's clear from the context that Nixon isn't saying, I know Lee Harvey Oswald, as a lone wolf, killed the President of the United States. He's not saying that at all. Right? Nixon, who kept his own security when he leaves office, by the way, right? When he goes to Sam San Clemente. Just understand, Nixon is making a threat, and he's leveraging the threat by talking about his knowledge of the Bay of Pigs thing. Well, the Empire Strikes Back. You know the person who moved the bullet hole on Kennedy's back to an angle that would allow that bullet to, go to the front seat? That member of the Warren Commission was Gerald Ford, right? One of the more interesting people in history. Just understand that after Nixon talks about the Bay of Pigs thing on his own taping system, right? Nixon, of course, had to pick a vice president. Spiro Agnew fell apart, was corrupt, got forced out of office. So who does he pick? He picks Gerald Ford. Now you need to track Gerald Ford, right? Ford's a more influential president than you think. He, of course, is the person who legalizes gold ownership, right? He, for the first time, Americans in the mid-70s were able to, again, buy gold, right? FDR, of course, prevented that in the 30s. But understand, there came a time in American history where Ronald Reagan needed a running mate. And Reagan turned to Gerald Ford. This part of history has been covered up. And they were negotiating to where Ford, who never won his own election, right? He becomes the Republican nominee after being Nixon's vice president, and then he loses to Jimmy Carter in 76. Right? Just understand, there are those who believe that Gerald Ford was the FBI mole on the Warren Commission. Well, Ronald Reagan needed a vice president. He first spoke to Gerald Ford. The Gerald Ford people, without winning the election, wanted a co-presidency. Google this. Right? They wanted a co-presidency. They wanted assurances that Reagan would give Ford enough power where Ford would have his own fiefdom within the Reagan administration. It's at that point that Reagan turned to his political opponent, who, by the way, happened to be a former CIA director, George H.W. Bush, who had called Reaganomics voodoo economics. You need to look at Gerald Ford, and you really need to ask yourself, what's the source of his power? Right? How does he end up on the Warren Commission? Right? How is he magically a Nixon running mate? A Nixon vice president? So, I'll just say, I had to turn off the ABC show on the Kennedy assassination. You're missing the story if you don't consider what happened after the assassination. And I'm not talking about Jack Ruby. I'm talking about the missing brain. I'm talking about the missing Harper fragment. I'm talking about the doctored autopsy that doesn't conform to what the doctors themselves saw at Parkland Hospital. Right, folks? Don't consider what happened to Kennedy to be part of some conspiracy theory. You already know that there was a conspiracy involved. There had to be. When the doctor who is talking about the throat shot being an entry wound and then later changes it so that it's an exit wound. Right? You understand, when the President of the United States gets assassinated, You have your pick of the best people to do an autopsy in the country, right? Particularly when the president is killed under these circumstances. And they picked a member of the military to do the autopsy, not Cyril Weck, for example. Right? So, you also know that there is some sloppiness when there are mentions to Oswald's wallet, and some wallet was left almost as if it's to frame Oswald at the J.D. Tippit site. Right? You realize, too, Oswald, who is going to events by himself with Michael Payne, right? Again, whose mother is Ruth Forbes Payne Young, may have known that Michael's mother was best friends with the former CIA director's mistress, right? So you can imagine Oswald, who himself was military, is there at the Texas School Book Depository, suddenly, and he's a relatively new employee, suddenly there are shots. Someone has shot at the president. Oswald may have understood. This is an intelligence hit. Who are they trying to frame here? Probably me, the Russian defector. How many people working for the Texas School Book Depository defected to Russia? One, Lee Harvey Oswald. Think it through. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. In sum, if you're watching a show and some pundit is on the show and they're saying, yes, people think all these people could have killed Kennedy, and they don't follow the narrative, consider the facts after Kennedy is hit, that show's doing you a disservice and is not worth watching. Those are my thoughts. I look forward to yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.